Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 338. I'm the host, Kyle Lansalone. On today's show, Michael Maharrey, the National Communications Director of the 10th Amendment Center and the news editor of Schiff Gold, returns to the show to talk about Defend the Guard and the spiraling national debt of the U.S. So this is a fantastic show. As always, Mike is absolutely fantastic. I know everybody's going to enjoy this episode. Please share it if you can. The show is hosted at the Libertarian Institute. We repost it on the blog at antiwar.com. YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version of the show. You can find it anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts, and you can support the show by doing your CBD shopping with Paloma Verde, PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo code PEACE, PEACE. When you spend 20%, or when you spend $75 or more, you'll get 20% off with that promo code. But the show is also going to get a kickback, so it's a fantastic way to help out yourself and to help out your favorite podcasts. Again, that's PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. Now here's the interview with Mike Maharrey. Mike Maharrey, welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. It's been way too long. How you doing?
I know, Kyle. It's great to talk to you, man. How are things?
Very good, and excited to have you on today because I want to talk about Defend the Guard and do an update on this. You wrote a fantastic article that we ran as a viewpoint at antiwar.com, and so I thought maybe we could go through this because I love your take on this. It's so important to say, that this is a way to check the Constitution of the war power. So I'll just let you take it ahead because, again, you wrote this fantastic article here.
Yeah, I think this is one of the most important pieces of state-level legislation that I've ever been involved with. And, of course, ironically, it's not probably very well known among most people. But this Defend the Guard bill, as you said, is really a way for state governments to at least attempt to put some type of check on the never-ending wars that the federal government seems to run. And part of the reason that the federal government can run unending wars is because they've completely abandoned the checks and balances that were inherent in the Constitution that were intended to make it really hard to go to war, to prevent, kings and I guess in our case presidents, but from these individuals unilaterally taking us into dangerous conflicts. So really the constitutional structure is that there shouldn't be any war, no offensive operation, as George Washington put it, without the approval of Congress. So the idea is that the representatives of the people debate and decide before we initiate any type of aggressive military actions. This takes it out of the hands of the president. You don't want one person making this decision. And so they were very careful in circumscribing this. But of course, we've completely abandoned this because Congress doesn't want to do its job. It would much rather just wash its hands of the matter, pass some broad sweeping, general, you can go to war if you want to resolution, and let the president make the decision. So we're really back to having a king. And we see the results of it. We've had decade upon decade upon decade of unending war. And, the cost in life, the cost in treasure, and really the cost in liberty, you can't even calculate all of that. James Madison, I think, very accurately said, you cannot have liberty when you're in a perpetual state of warfare. That's a paraphrase. But he explained a lot of the different things that come out of war: debts, taxes, a powerful executive branch, and then even worse, the degradation of morals that you see in the culture when really you're creating a culture of killing. So what do you do about it? We've got Congress that won't do its job. The president is certainly not going to restrain himself. What can we do? Well, we have this Defend the Guard bill, and basically what it does is very simple. It puts the power of sending National Guard troops into combat into the hands of the governors where it belongs. After all, the National Guard really in effect is the formalization of the militia. And the militia is supposed to be under the control of the state. And the militia is only allowed to be called into action on, three general, what's the word I'm looking for? Three things have to happen, or one of three things have to happen before the government can send the militia into war. The militia can be called up to execute the laws of the Union, to suppress insurrections, or to repel invasions. So really, the militia, or the National Guard, was really supposed to be just a defensive unit. We give them even a little bit more latitude in Defend the Guard, in that it will allow for the deployment into what they call active duty combat. That is allowed if one of those three criteria are met, or if there is an official declaration of war passed by Congress, something that hasn't happened since World War II. So under this bill, if one of those criteria is not met, then the governor will have the authority to say, we're not sending our National Guard troops into this combat situation. And that's a big problem for the Department of Defense, because a large number of troops that have been deployed into Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, even into Africa, a lot of these have been National Guard units. So if the governors can take that control back and say, you all declare war, you all have the debate, I think we'd see a lot less war. So that's why we're really pushing this bill. I think it's extremely important. There are a number, it's one of these things that's really created a lot of bipartisan cooperation. You have people on the left and the right that can support this. One of the big organizations that's pushing this is Bring Our Troops Home, which is really a kind of a coalition of kind of conservative folks that were in the military but recognized that the military is being used in an improper way and not to the betterment of American national interests. So it's extremely important. Last year there were about 25 states that introduced Defend the Guard, and we hope to see at least that number, if not more, in the upcoming legislative sessions. And, the first important part of this is just getting this debate out there, getting people to recognize, number one, that we have unending war and that there is a cost, and that it is not within the realm of the Constitution. I think this is particularly important for folks that are kind of conservative or on the right, because we have this idea of limited government. You can't have limited government when you're constantly in war. It's impossible. So there's an educational aspect of this, but I hope at some point a state will be willing to stand up to the powers that be, that'll be willing to stand up to the Department of Defense and all the powerful lobbies that don't want this to happen, and pass this bill. Because if one state does it, you'll see a lot of states follow suit. So that's kind of the nutshell of Defend the Guard. I don't know if that was a nutshell or not. It might have been a more of a treatise, but
no, very good, very helpful. And with Bring Our Troops Home, Hunter DeRensis works there. He's my colleague at the Libertarian Institute, so he's talked about it. I've also had Scott Spalding on, who's in the National Guard and a vet, I believe, of the Marine Corps, and he's talked about. I just want to highlight the 10th Amendment perspective a little bit more, where I may say this to someone, particularly somebody on the right, and they would say and fire back and say, well, normally I would agree with you, but when it comes to war, the president is the commander-in-chief, the National Guard falls under the Department of Defense, and so, he rules them and he could send them wherever they want to go, and that's how the Constitution works. Your 10th Amendment really doesn't apply here, Mike. Bring it somewhere else.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a very common misunderstanding of what it means to be commander-in-chief. Commander-in-chief doesn't mean you get to decide U.S. foreign policy. Commander-in-chief simply means that when there is a war, when there is a military operation, the president's job is to direct that military operation. And it's really no different from the division of power between making law and executing law. So it's really more fundamental than even war powers, because this applies to any power. The way it's supposed to work is Congress, which are the representatives of the people. Your representative from your state represents your interests. The president is kind of a general. He's an executive. he puts things into action. So the way the constitutional structure is supposed to be is that Congress passes laws. In the case of war, they declare war. And then the president acts within the bounds that Congress gives him to execute the war, to put it into execution. But it's the Congress that's supposed to make the decision about when to go to war, how to go to war, and when to get out of the war. All of that should be done at the congressional level. And then basically the president executes that. The president does what Congress says. The Congress has usurped its responsibility. Not usurped, that's the wrong word. The Congress has absolved itself of its responsibility. It's basically brushed its hands off. And what they do instead is they pass what they call, what do they call them? My mind just went blank.
Authorizations
to use force. Yeah. So basically what these AUMFs do is they say, okay, Mr. President, we're going to give you permission to decide if we're going to go to war or not. If you look at these, the way these are written, it puts all of the decision-making in the hands of the president. Basically, you're saying, we're not going to do it, you do it. That's not right. Again, it's the whole idea of you don't want a single person making these huge decisions. That was a huge thing with the founding generation. They didn't want too much control in the hands of a single individual because individuals are prone to, their own whims. Ostensibly, if you have a body of people, if you have all of these representatives in Congress and all of these people in the Senate, if all of these people are having to debate and make the decision, it's harder to make the decision. You're going to have a better, more reasoned out, more focused decision than you're going to get with this single individual. So the first thing I would say to my conservative friend is that don't talk Constitution at me if you're not going to respect the divisions of powers within the Constitution. But that brings us to the next question. And this is really a fundamental constitutional question. We have this idea of limited government. The federal government, I think everybody would agree, is only supposed to do certain things. Now, we may debate what those certain things are, but virtually nobody will say the federal government gets to do whatever it wants. Well, some people will, but most people that have any understanding of the American constitutional system or federalism is going to understand that there are limits on federal power. The question then becomes, how do you keep the federal government within that limit? I mean, obviously, you can't just wave the Constitution around like a red flag and government people are going to go, oh, okay. Words on paper don't stop people, or as James Madison called them, parchment barriers. There has to be some enforcement mechanism. And it was always understood that the enforcement mechanism would be the states, that the states would hold the federal government within the limits of their power. And James Madison talked about this in Federalist 46. And this is the cornerstone of everything that we do at the 10th Amendment Center. James Madison wrestled with this question, as did all of the founders during the ratification debates. What do you do when the federal government oversteps its bounds? And James Madison gave us this blueprint in Federalist 46. And he said the means of opposition are powerful and at hand. And then he listed some things that you could do. And some of them are things that you might think of. You protest and you petition, and governors can complain. So you can create this kind of tension and put pressure on the federal government. But the most important step that Madison said we should take is a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. Those are his exact words. So in other words, when the federal government is committing what he called an unwarrantable act, which is unconstitutional, or even a warrantable act that happens to be unpopular, he said this refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union would create obstructions for the federal government. And he said if a bunch of states did it, it would create impediments which the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. So he understood that the federal government needs state action to do anything. And he understood this 200 and some years ago, before the federal government was as big as it is now. He recognized that it would still need the cooperation of the states. And he basically said if you take that cooperation away, then you can check what the federal government is doing. This specifically applies to the use of the militia. Daniel Webster, who was a nationalist, he was a big government guy, but he wasn't happy with the fact that during the War of 1812, the federal government started to conscript militia from the northern states, who by and large weren't in favor of the War of 1812. And this is what Daniel Webster said. He said, Mr. Chairman, A worthy member has asked who are the... Nope, wrong one. That is the wrong quote. Let's find the correct quote. Where are you, Mr. Webster? There he is. Yeah, he said that the operation of measures thus unconstitutional and illegal, and he's talking about this conscription of the militia. The operation of measures thus unconstitutional and illegal ought to be prevented by a resort to other measures which are both constitutional and legal. It will be the solemn duty of state governments to protect their own authority over their own militia and to interpose between their citizens and arbitrary powers. These are among the objects for which state governments exist. So he was basically saying that if the federal government is going to overstep its bounds and use its militia in a way, our militia, in a way that is unconstitutional and illegal, that the states should interpose, set themselves between their citizens and the arbitrary power of the federal government, and stop that action. He was saying, take James Madison's blueprint, apply it here, and stop the federal government from using the militia in a way that is outside of its power and authority. So this is really, if you want to talk in terms of conservatism, this is the essence of conservatism. It's holding government within its bounds. And I think that anybody who's a conservative should understand this, but for some reason we've got this warped thing that, you know, spreading democracy around the world and all of this has somehow become part of conservatism. It's not conservatism. That is liberalism. I mean, that is leftism and progressivism, that we're somehow going to impose our form on the rest of the world. And it's, you know, we can see again the cost, trillions of dollars in money, thousands of lives lost, American lives, not to mention millions of lives lost overseas. And those lives matter too. And then again, the loss of liberty here at home, TSA, spying, militarization of police, all asset forfeiture, all of this stuff filters and trickles down from the warfare state and this perpetual state of warfare that we've been in. So it needs to be stopped. We need to take this action. And whether you're left, right, center, or don't care anything at all about politics, it's important to get behind this, because I think this is something that transcends partisanship, transcends political philosophy. I think we could probably all come to agree that we shouldn't just be running around starting wars and involving ourselves in military conquests that aren't benefiting our interest whatsoever. And furthermore, if we are, we should at least go through the proper channels and come to an agreement through the representative body, the Congress, instead of just letting Joe Biden or Donald Trump or whatever sociopath ends up in the White House next make these decisions on their own.
Yeah. So, you know, one of the reasons I really like this legislation is because there's really two benefits here. One is it's going to constrain the Pentagon somewhat. For anybody, I follow all the, like, you know, the Massachusetts National Guard, the New Hampshire National Guard, the Florida National Guard. I follow all those accounts on Twitter. And so every time they send troops somewhere or do training somewhere, so the Michigan National Guard has, you know, troops from Lithuania and all these other countries come to Michigan and they train there. In I think Kentucky, their National Guard actually went to Somalia and Northern Africa. The Florida National Guard is training the Ukrainian troops in Eastern Europe, right? And so the reason that they're using the National Guard isn't just because, the Florida likes, the people from Florida like Eastern Europe and they really want to go, so we sent them. It's because they need, that personnel, because the DOD personnel is out doing other things. So it constrains there, but also, if you look at Hurricane Katrina, the Louisiana National Guard was deployed. If you look at wildfires, I think they were in 2020. The Oregon National Guard, their heavy lift helicopters were in Afghanistan, and then, that they couldn't fight their wildfires for that reason. And so, those are kind of two benefits. Not only is there like the bigger benefit of stopping war, but there's also, local benefits at home where, maybe things could be a little bit better. You could respond better to national disasters. Not that, me and you think that we need a military unit to respond to a hurricane. But the way the current system is set up, those are the people that are kind of trained and the state has to respond to a hurricane. And
Right,
so when they're
exactly.
gone, that kind of piece of the puzzle is missing. That equipment is missing. Those helicopters were gone. There wasn't anybody there to operate them, military or not. And so, that's a major problem. But then, especially when we talk about that first piece, if it really is going to constrain the Pentagon, then it's a threat to the military-industrial complex. And from my understanding, a lot of times that this legislation has started to move forward, the DoD has come in and said, you'll lose funding and things like this. Mm-hmm. Now, in one sense, I'm like, hell yeah, like these people are afraid if they're talking about cutting funding. In the other sense, just knowing how state governments work, they typically, I think, cave to the federal government when the federal government breaks out the checkbook and is like, you want us to void all these checks we have written for you? And so, anyways, all that is to say, what are the chances that this gets passed or moves forward somewhere in, the next couple of years?
Well, I'm not going to lie, it's an uphill battle. And for many of the reasons that you just pointed out. And I think the bill has moved the farthest in West Virginia. Pat McGeehan, who's a representative in that state, fantastic guy, was really the first person to start pushing Defend the Guard. I think it was like 2016, the first time that he ran this bill. And a couple of years ago, he actually did some parliamentary maneuvering and got it out of committee and onto the House floor. And was very, very close to getting enough votes to get it passed. And it's exactly what you said happened. The adjutant general of the West Virginia National Guard shows up in his full military regalia, general stars on his shoulder, and he starts lobbying, and he's saying, if we do this, then the Pentagon's going to take away all of our units and move them somewhere else. And first off, I think a lot of that's just hot air. I think that it's bluster, and I think when push comes to shove, oftentimes the feds will back down. And secondly, as you said, it's just an intimidation thing, and these representatives see this guy and he's in his military uniform and he's telling them, if you do this, it's going to destroy the world, and they get all scared and back off. So it's going to take some folks like Pat, a lot of folks like Pat McGeehan, who have the cojones to stand up to it. And I think the good news here is that, as you mentioned, there are so many people that are former military that are in this movement. McGeehan himself was an intelligence officer in the Air Force and did deployments in Iraq. So these aren't people who are just like, hippies that they drug out of the 60s somewhere. These are formidable folks who have experience in the military world and have credibility there. So I think that bodes well. But it's going to be difficult. And I think the first important thing is to get it introduced, to begin the discussion, and to swing public support behind this legislation, because especially in the state government, that's important. If you get enough people that are making phone calls, sending emails, showing up at state legislative hearings, that has an impact, much bigger impact than what you're going to get by calling your congressman. Calling your state representative and your state senator, you get much more bang for your buck. So I think this is a long process. Thomas Jefferson famously said that liberty is won by inches. It's not won in a day. And I think it's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of work. But the good news is there is a very concerted, strong group of people that are behind this, that have no intention of giving up, that have pushed the ball forward every single year. And I do think at some point we're going to hit that tipping point, and a state's going to say, you know what, we're going to pass this. And once one state does it, I think you'll start to see those state dominoes fall. So I'm optimistic long term. I'm not optimistic that it's going to pass tomorrow. And that's just the nature of politics. But we have to be willing to stay engaged, to keep fighting, to keep pushing, because I don't know that there's a more important issue than war and peace. There isn't, in my opinion. Other people might disagree with me, but I think war and peace are the central issue of the day, and that we need to do anything that we can to make the world a more peaceful place, a more cooperative place, instead of trying to bully everybody to do it the way the U.S. The U.S. says. So.
Yeah. Well, and look, I've been talking about this on the show recently. There's a lot of polling that says, Americans want diplomacy. They don't want war. But
Yes.
if you look at Congress, it's like Thomas Massey and then 500 other people who are just
Exactly.
steadfast pro-war. And so...
Yeah.
Maybe in the States we do have a better chance because, look, as much as these represent, like Nancy Pelosi isn't a real human, right? But whoever your state, representative is, like, usually it's some lady that sends her kids to public school or so. You know what I mean? It's not quite as elite of a person that's so unreachable. And so maybe we can make some of these arguments. Now, I do want to move on and ask you, I usually just talk about war and peace on the show, and I usually keep it, to the questions of morality and why this foreign policy isn't going to work. But I ultimately am starting to think here that, the old Ron Paul saying that eventually we'll run out of money and that's what will end the American war machine and empire. Well, $31 trillion in debt, you say, here on October 8th, this post for the 10th Amendment Center. A $31 trillion national debt matters much more than most think. So why does it matter so much? Because I remember when the national debt was so small, people actually talked about paying it back. I can't even imagine that's possible. Even
not.
the Fed is thinking about that now.
Right. No, it's not. This is an unsustainable trajectory. And really this flows into, or maybe out of, the foreign policy discussion, because why are we $31 trillion in debt? Well, part of the reason we're $31 trillion in debt is we're spending trillions and trillions of dollars every single year on the military-industrial complex so that we can wage wars all over the world. I mean, how much money has the United States sent to Ukraine just in the last 6 months? I mean, it's a staggering amount of money. So that money doesn't just come out of thin air. I mean, it kind of does, but ultimately it doesn't. And I think it's important. We've gotten to a point, because I remember in the 90s, the national debt was a big deal. And I don't remember what the national debt was in the 90s, but it certainly wasn't $31 trillion. It was much lower than this, and people were concerned about it. And people would say, hey, we need to get the spending under control. Now it's gotten to the point, trillions of dollars later, the people are like, doesn't matter. And I think there's this mentality that it hasn't caused a problem yet, so it's not going to cause a problem later. We can just keep kicking the can down the road. I say this all the time, though. Eventually, when you play kick the can down the road, you run out of road. At some point, I can't tell you when, I can't tell you how, but at some point that can is going to get to the end of the road, and it's going to be a major financial collapse, and it's going to be ugly for a lot of people. And here's the other thing I think people need to understand. We have this mentality kind of that government's free, right? I mean, we pay taxes. Nobody likes to pay taxes, but, for most people, a tax burden is manageable, and most people don't even realize it because it's coming directly out of their check. People like me that have to write the check, it's a little more personal. But for most people, I don't think that they feel like the tax burden is significant. So therefore, why not send money to Ukraine? We've got plenty of money. There's money out there, right? You are paying for all of this spending every time you go to the grocery store, every time you go to the gas station, every time you buy clothes, because we're paying for this through the inflation tax. And this is what I want people to understand. This is why I say this debt matters more than you think, because you're paying for it, right? The government is borrowing money. It's borrowing these trillions of dollars. It's selling bonds. Nobody wants, well, not nobody. A lot of people want these bonds because the U.S. dollar is the reserve currency. But even so, there are more bonds than there are people that want them. There's more supply of U.S. government debt than there is demand for it. So the Federal Reserve steps in and it buys the bonds by creating money out of thin air, and it pumps that money into the economy. This is exactly what happened during coronavirus. They did it on steroids. They pumped like almost $5 trillion into the U.S. economy just via quantitative easing, which is buying these bonds. All of that money's sloshing around, and then Donald Trump and Joe Biden hand out stimulus checks, and then people start spending all of that money, and you've got more dollars chasing the same amount of goods and services. Of course, during the pandemic, it was less because nobody was producing anything, and we got consumer price inflation. That's the inflation tax. You are paying for your stimulus checks today when you go to the gas station. People need to make that connection. Government is never free. The wars are never free. Welfare is never free. Whatever thing you want the government to do is never free. You're going to pay for it. You're either going to pay for it through taxes or the inflation tax. And at some point, this whole system is going to fall apart because it's unsustainable. You can't keep printing money forever. And we're already starting to see countries like Russia, China, big players in Asia. They're doing what they can to minimize their exposure to the U.S. dollar because they recognize that the printing press has its limits. And at some point, you want to talk about threats. Everyone say, oh, we've got to worry about Russia or China invading. The biggest foreign policy threat is the dollar toppling from its perch as the reserve currency, because when that happens, America is no longer an economic or military power because it can no longer print the money to do this. So we better get it under control now. We better figure it out now before it just collapses, because it's going to be ugly for people, and they really need to wrap their head around this. People ask me sometimes, Mike, if you could get rid of any government agency in the world, what would it be? Or in the United States? And I used to say the Department of Defense because, as I mentioned, I think the issue of war and peace is the most pressing issue that we face. But then I thought about it. It's like, no, it's the Fed, because the Fed makes it all possible by printing the money. The Fed is the machine that runs the largest government and the biggest empire in the history of the world. And, I fear that nobody's ever going to get it under control because it's too easy to play kick the can down the road. But at some point, a crisis is going to force our hands. And this is a foreign policy issue. This is a matter of national security, if you want to frame it that way. Because when the U.S. loses its economic superiority, it loses its military superiority, and it becomes basically England that runs around and has kings and queens, but not really any real power in the world. And quite frankly, I don't want the U.S. to have power in the world, but I want it to be on our terms, not because we've destroyed all of the prosperity that 200 years of American history have given us. So that's the end of that rant.
Yeah, and maybe just to add on to that a little bit, with the U.S. sanctions regime now targeting so many countries, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, China's kind of counter trade organization to the U.S. Right. Now, with all the countries involved, I think the 14 countries, the 15th country is going to be Turkey, a NATO member, but that's over half of the world's population involved in that now. The Biden administration can't get the Saudis to do what they want on oil production, right, no matter how many threats they make. And so, while it seems like this is impossible, I'm in my 30s, Mike, so like in my lifetime the national debt has always been an issue. There's always been this crisis that the dollar is going to lose its spot as the world reserve currency. But it hasn't happened, so I think, maybe people think it can happen. But right, if you look at all the details and what's going on in the world, it is happening. We just don't notice it yet, but it's going to be very noticed, and it's going to be very fast. It's going to seem like it happened all at once. It didn't, but it's going to really feel that way, I think. Anyways,
go ahead. That's a really good point. Let me just mention this for folks that are a little bit older. Things don't change until they do, right? And when you were talking about that, the first thing that popped into my head was the fall of the Soviet Union. I was an 80s kid, so I lived the Cold War. I actually ducked under my desk to avoid the nuclear weapons, which apparently, according to the public service announcement in New York City, is still the strategy that we're using. We're going to hide under our desk from the nukes. So I grew up in that Cold War thing. And as a teenager in the 80s, I could never have imagined that the Soviet Union would ever collapse. That was impossible, right? And then one day I wake up and they're tearing down the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union splitting up, and it all. That was years in the making. It was years of economic unsustainability and political unsustainability in the Soviet Union that finally, in a very short time, led to a collapse. But the rot was happening all along. We just didn't see it. We didn't realize it. It was a paper tiger. I think the U.S. is a lot like that, and people need to be aware of it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mike. You are the communications director of the 10th Amendment Center. You work at Schiff. I know you do a podcast through there. I just had on Alan Mosley, so I know you also do the Sports Ball podcast, but
Yes.
I probably missed some things, so just go ahead, tell my audience like where you work, and then if the 10th Amendment Center is like has any big initiatives going on right now, like you need a call to action, like let people know what they could do to help you guys out.
Well, and that's if you want to check out what I'm doing, that's the first place that I would ask you to go is 10thamendmentcenter.com and just check out the work that we're doing. We're taking this idea of defend the guard, which is built on this non-cooperation. We're applying that to all kinds of issues. If you go to 10th Amendment Center, go to the front page, you can download our State of the Nullification Movement report. It's like a 50-page PDF report. It's free, and it'll give you a good idea what this whole nullification, non-cooperation strategy is all about. And you can get involved with what we're doing there. Right now, it's kind of quiet. We'll be ramping up here in the next couple of months as we get ready for what we call nullification season, which is the state legislative sessions, which typically run from early January through spring, getting in April, May. So that's our busiest times in terms of activism. So right now we're just kind of getting ramped up, getting things in line, getting ready for that. If you're interested in investing, finance, what's going on at the Fed, check out schiffgold.com. You can go to schiffgold.com/news and see all of the articles I'm writing. Check out my podcast, The Friday Gold Wrap. I talk a lot about the Fed. People gripe at me because we're supposed to talk about gold and all you talk about is the Fed. Again, the Fed is the monster. The Fed is what is driving all of this. So if you want to learn about that, you can go to 10th Amendment Center. And then my side project for folks who are interested in kind of the relationship between the Christian faith and libertarian anarchism, voluntarism, you can go to godarchy.org. I do a podcast through that. It's not just for Christians, but it is coming from a Christian worldview. And we talk about why violence, force, and coercion is not the best way to order a society. And so you can check that out as well. So those are the things.
All right, Maharrey, thank you so much for coming back on the show. And I'll definitely have you back on. It won't be a couple years this time. I'll keep it down to a few months. Thanks,
well,
man.
Great. I really appreciate it. Thank you.